What if the government isn't trying to destroy the monsters, but keep them alive? In this chilling story, a routine highway detour traps hundreds in a sealed nightmare, a massive containment zone hiding something far worse than anyone imagined. As deadly creatures hunt survivors one by one, a darker truth begins to surface. The true horror isn't just the creatures themselves, but the silent system built to manage them. Prepare yourself for the ceiling, a tale of survival, control, and the terrifying cost of being allowed to live. The static on the radio was the first sign. I'd driven this stretch of I-64 hundreds of times before. The old familiar highways through the forests of West Virginia usually offered nothing but winding roads, endless trees, and occasional deer darting out in front of you. Today, though, the trees stood unnaturally still, as if even the wind was holding its breath. I reached for the radio dial instinctively, tapping it twice. It had been playing a song I'd heard since college, something by Memory Revival, an old indie band, but the song had cut out mid-chorus. Just a long, faint buzz now, like the radio waves themselves were being strangled. I tried not to let the unease creep in. The sun was still high, though slightly muted behind a thin veil of gray clouds. My hands tightened on the wheel as the road curved gently downward, the forest rising tall and dense on both sides. Then came the vibration. At first, I thought it was a mechanical issue, a misaligned wheel maybe, but the tremor spread outward. The asphalt itself shuddered beneath me, and I glanced at the rear-view mirror just in time to see a long line of brake lights flaring to life behind me. Up ahead, red taillights blinked and vehicles slowed rapidly, some veering slightly as if the ground beneath them had momentarily shifted. The tremor deepened into a low, throaty rumble, something that didn't come from above, but from beneath. My chest vibrated with it. The steering wheel shivered in my hands. Then came the wind. A sudden, fierce gust slammed into the side of my sedan, rocking it like a boat caught in an unexpected squall. Leaves, dust, and debris whipped into small tornadoes along the edge of the highway. Instinctively, I rolled up the windows as the swirling cloud passed across my windshield, reducing visibility to nothing but a swirling brown haze. When it cleared, I found myself in the middle of a rapidly forming traffic jam. Cars ahead were creeping forward, uncertain. Behind me, others had already stopped completely. I could see drivers stepping out of their vehicles, talking on phones, pointing to the tree line. And then the emergency broadcast tone sliced through the static, a sharp, high-pitched whine that made me flinch, followed by an automated voice. This is a localized emergency alert. Event code geological containment. All drivers are instructed to reduce speed immediately, turn off climate control systems, and proceed to the nearest off-ramp under police supervision. Repeat. Event code geological containment. The voice repeated, flat and robotic, looping the same instructions. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the wheel. Geological containment? What the hell was that supposed to mean? Ahead, I could already see flashing lights. Dozens of police cruisers had formed a barricade across the lanes, guiding vehicles off the main highway and into a makeshift side route cut through a clearing. This wasn't a normal road closure. This was something else. I followed the line of cars like everyone else, glancing at the uniformed officers positioned every few hundred feet. They wore not just the standard sheriff's uniforms, but heavy-duty riot gear, complete with clear face shields and what looked disturbingly like gas masks. Some of them held bullhorns, others rifles slung tight across their backs. As my car was waved forward, I felt my stomach knot. They were funneling us into a wide, flat clearing, carved out from what must have once been an old construction site or service lot. I saw rows of other vehicles already tightly packed in, like sardines in a can, bumper to bumper. The officers waved me toward the second row. I hesitated briefly, but the officer at my driver's side window gave a sharp, circular motion with his gloved hand. I obeyed. The cars were packed so tightly I couldn't open my door fully once I'd shifted into park. Mirrors practically touched mirrors. The air smelled faintly of earth, like something freshly dug. Around me, drivers were nervously glancing around, phones pressed to ears, but judging from the frustrated expressions, no one seemed to be getting any signal. My phone displayed no service in mocking letters. I tried 3 different apps, calls, texts, even my offline maps, but nothing responded. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. The emergency broadcast was still looping through the car's speaker, now eerily louder, though I had no control over the volume. Event code: geological containment. I spotted movement 2 rows ahead. Someone, perhaps out of panic or defiance, was stepping out of their car, shouting toward one of the officers. His voice was muffled, but his aggression was clear as he gestured wildly with his hands. Without hesitation, one of the officers raised his weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. "Stay in your vehicles! Lock your doors!" the officer bellowed afterward, amplified by the bullhorn. "There will be no second warnings." The shouting man quickly retreated into his car, slamming the doors shut. I exhaled sharply and locked my doors too, as if that would somehow make a difference. Minutes crawled by like hours. Sweat began pooling at the base of my neck, despite the mild spring air. The oppressive feeling of being boxed in pressed heavily on my chest. In my peripheral vision, I saw movement again. This time it was several officers moving between the cars, and one of them, wearing white cotton gloves beneath his tactical gear, stepped onto the hood of a vehicle nearby, crouched low, and gently swabbed the roof with what looked like a collection pad. Without hesitation, he sealed it inside a small, vacuum-sealed pouch using a handheld heat gun. They were collecting samples. Samples of what? My thoughts spiraled, the pounding of my heart drowning out even the droning voice from the radio. The air inside the car grew heavier with each passing minute. The static from the radio still buzzed faintly, but now it was joined by the rhythmic pounding of my heart. Around me, the others had settled into a tense, suffocating silence. No one dared move, no one spoke. Even the children in nearby cars had gone eerily quiet, as if they too sensed the weight of something unnatural pressing down upon us. An hour must have passed, maybe longer. Time had lost its grip on me. The police continued their slow patrols, weaving between the tightly packed cars. I watched them, trying to read their body language, looking for some kind of reassurance. There was none. Their faces were hidden behind those cold, expressionless masks. Suddenly, a low mechanical rumble interrupted the stillness. From the far edge of the clearing, a massive truck rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the thinning daylight. Mounted on its back was a cylindrical tank, glistening under the setting sun like a giant silver pill. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker mounted on the truck's roof. "We will now begin decontamination procedures. Please ensure all windows are fully sealed and doors locked. Do not exit your vehicles under any circumstances. Failure to comply will be met with immediate response." The voice repeated itself, cold and mechanical, several times. Then the hissing began. From long hoses mounted along the truck's flanks, a high-powered stream of mist sprayed outward, coating the vehicles in a thin chemical fog. The vapor clung to the cars like morning dew, leaving a greasy residue that distorted the fading sunlight into strange, oily halos. The smell hit almost instantly, a sharp, acrid sting that burned my nostrils. Chlorine, or something like it. Definitely not water. As the mist settled, several officers stepped onto the hoods and roofs once more, checking each vehicle's seals, pounding lightly on windows, ensuring compliance. One paused at my car, peering inside. Though his face was hidden, I could feel his eyes searching mine, as though silently assessing me. He moved on without a word. The chemical haze lingered in the air long after the spraying stopped. My eyes burned slightly, and I tried to breathe shallowly to avoid the sting. Then came the final phase. 2 police cruisers rolled forward, each dragging one corner of an enormous black tarp behind them. The plastic sheet unfurled like a suffocating curtain, slowly stretching across the entire clearing. Teams of officers worked quickly, anchoring the tarp's edges with large sandbags and heavy rocks, sealing us inside a makeshift dome. The last sliver of natural light vanished as the plastic was pulled tight over my head. Total darkness swallowed us. Only the faintest slivers of light remained. Small, desperate beams from cell phones, their users clutching them like life preservers in a sea of black. My pulse throbbed in my ears. The heat inside the car rose rapidly, made worse by the chemical residue that seemed to cling to every surface. Sweat pooled beneath my shirt, sticking my back to the seat. My breathing grew shallow again, this time not from caution, but from something far more primal: fear. And then came the first sound. It was soft at first, a faint wet clicking, like someone gently snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. But it didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere. Dozens of tiny, precise clicks, echoing softly within the cavernous dark space we now shared. A second, louder click answered from farther away, then another, and another. They were communicating. I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled force, my palms slick with sweat. My vision tunneled as the sense of claustrophobia fully set in, wrapping around me like an invisible vice. The car no longer felt like protection. It felt like a coffin. 2 cars to my left, the male student. One of the college kids I'd seen earlier leaned toward my window, mouthing something. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but his meaning was clear. Back seat. I nodded. It was smarter, less exposed. I slowly shifted my weight, easing my body between the seats, careful not to jostle anything that might make noise. My knee brushed against the center console, nearly knocking loose a plastic bottle. I caught it mid-fall, swallowing hard as I settled into the cramped back row. The 2 students were doing the same in their vehicle, hunkering down, eyes darting toward the darkness around us. The clicking continued. Then, somewhere ahead, came the first scream. Short, sharp, and abruptly cut off. What followed was worse, a sound like cracking bone, like wet fabric tearing, accompanied by a dull rhythmic thudding. I bit my lip hard, drawing blood as I fought back, the rising panic clawing at my chest. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that some terrified person had simply lost control, panicked in the dark. But the noises that followed were too grotesque, too deliberate. Something was being torn apart. One of the remaining phones nearby flickered, its beam of light catching for just a moment the outline of something moving across the plastic above us. A heavy shadow passed overhead, disturbingly agile for its size. The plastic flexed as weight shifted. The frame of my car creaked slightly under the strain. The girl in the other vehicle clamped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she pressed herself into the corner of her back seat. More clicks, faster now, another scream, another wet, horrible crunch. The nightmare had begun, and we were trapped inside it. The silence after the screams was heavier than any sound could have been. I sat frozen in the back seat, the darkness thick, swallowing every shape and edge. The only thing grounding me was the faint hum of the car's electronics, a weak background noise that felt oddly comforting. My breath came slow, controlled, as if even the sound of air passing through my throat could attract attention. The clicking continued, sharp and wet, moving like ripples across a black ocean. First ahead, then to my left, then far behind. I couldn't tell how many of them there were. Dozens? Hundreds? The clicks blended with the creaks of metal as the weight of unseen bodies shifted overhead. The plastic tarp flexed again. Something big moved just inches above the roof of my car. Suddenly, a sharp thud hit the car next to mine. I flinched, instinctively pulling my knees closer to my chest. Through the faint gleam of a nearby phone's dying screen, I saw one of the creatures for the first time. He was perched on the hood of the neighboring vehicle, partially draped in the black plastic, but enough of it was visible under the slight glow. Its form was humanoid in the roughest sense, a torso and limbs, but elongated, hunched forward. Its skin glistened like oil, smooth and wet, reflecting just enough light to hint at its slick surface. What struck me most were its legs, reverse-jointed, like some predatory bird of impossible proportions, ending in massive hooked talons that scraped against the car's metal with sickening ease. Its head moved sharply, like a bird tracking prey, twisting side to side as if tasting the air. The mouth was wide, impossibly so, filled with multiple rows of teeth, serrated like a shark's, glinting faintly as the lips parted and closed in small, rhythmic pulses. Its breathing was nearly silent, but I could feel it. The weight of its presence pressed against my chest like an invisible hand. The thing tilted its head sharply, emitting one long, deliberate click. Another click answered from somewhere behind me. My vision tunneled. My pulse pounded in my ears. The students in the neighboring car huddled together, their hands clasped tightly, eyes wide and glassy with terror. And then, as if sensing the smallest disturbance, the creature's head snapped toward the weak glow of one last phone screen several rows over. In an instant it was gone, leaping gracefully, soundlessly toward its next victim. The tarp shifted violently as another scream cut through the darkness, then abruptly stopped. A wet gurgle followed, then silence again. I couldn't move, not because I was frozen by fear, though I was, but because there was simply nowhere to go. The cars had been parked so close that even opening a door was impossible. We were sealed in, contained, caged like animals awaiting slaughter. Another faint glow flickered near the edge of the lot, a flashlight or a phone. I barely made it out through the thin gaps where the plastic hadn't fully sealed. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was rescue, someone finally coming to help. But then I saw the outline of the figure standing near the tarp's perimeter. It wasn't a cop, no gas mask, no gear, just a person standing too still, head slightly cocked as though listening. The plastic ruffled again. More of them moved outside the dome now. I wasn't sure which was worse, the things inside or the things waiting outside. A crackling voice echoed through the heavy air from a distant speaker. The same cold, automated tone that had warned us earlier. Remain calm. The containment procedure is in progress. Do not attempt to exit your vehicle. Help is coming. Remain calm. The message repeated on an endless loop, a macabre parody of comfort. No one moved. No one believed it. Beside me, my phone buzzed once, then died completely. Battery gone. Useless. The air was growing hotter by the minute. The chemical residue from the earlier spraying clung to the interior, creating a sharp, nauseating aroma that made my head swim. My shirt clung to my skin, soaked in sweat. Claustrophobia gnawed at me again, more brutal this time. This wasn't just containment, this was preparation. I replayed the sequence of events in my head. The road closure, the emergency alert, the forced relocation into this lot, the chemical spray, the tarp. None of this was random. They had done this before. They knew what was coming. We were never meant to be protected. We were meant to be trapped. I thought back to my brother. 10 years ago, he'd been involved in a highway incident, suspiciously close to this area. The report said it was a geological collapse. A sinkhole caused his car to flip, killing him instantly. I hadn't believed it then, and I sure as hell didn't believe it now. Whatever this was, it had been going on far longer than any of us knew. A sharp metallic creak pulled me back to the present. One of the creatures was crawling across the roof of my car again. I could feel its weight shifting, pressing down slightly on the thin metal shell above me. The frame moaned softly under the strain. My breath caught in my throat as I curled tighter into the corner of the back seat, squeezing my eyes shut. Then, another click. Louder. Directly above me, it knew. I barely dared to breathe. After an agonizing pause, the weight shifted again, and the creature moved on, its body gliding like liquid over the vehicles as it joined its brethren elsewhere. But I knew it wouldn't be the last time. They were hunting with patience, like wolves circling a wounded deer, and we were all bleeding. Minutes dissolved into hours, or at least it felt that way. The air inside my car had grown staler with every shallow breath I took. Sweat trickled down my spine in thin rivulets. My muscles ached from holding the same curled position for so long, and still I didn't dare move. The clicks and wet scraping continued outside, a constant reminder that we were not alone and not in control. Somewhere nearby, I heard low, ragged breathing, a muffled sob. The girl in the other car had lost her ability to hold it together. The boy next to her whispered hurried reassurances, but even from here I could hear the tremble in his voice. His comfort was hollow, meant as much for himself as for her. A sudden loud scrape of claws across metal jolted us all. The creatures were still roaming freely. They were testing, listening, waiting. Each time one of them crossed overhead, I could hear the metal creak beneath their weight, could feel the faint dip of my car's roof under their claws. Through a tiny gap between the tarp and the ground, I caught a flash of pale moonlight reflecting off something metallic. An officer was standing at the far end of the lot again, or at least it looked like an officer. But even at this distance, something was wrong. The figure stood too stiffly, head tilted at an unnatural angle. No movement, no flashlight, just the glint of the badge catching faint light, and it wasn't wearing a gas mask. Another sharp scream ripped through the darkness. This one was closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against the seat cushion, forcing myself to focus on my breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale, repeat. I counted the breaths, using them like anchors to keep me from panicking. A new sound joined the clicking, something I hadn't heard before. Low, rhythmic, knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from the creatures. This was deliberate, human. 3 knocks at steady intervals, echoing faintly beneath the tarp, bouncing off the hoods and windows of the vehicles. Then silence, and then another 3. I recognized the pattern instantly, though I didn't understand its meaning. It was a signal. Someone else inside was trying to communicate, or warn. But what were they signaling? Were they trying to lure us out? Or was it a desperate attempt to coordinate an escape? The knocking grew louder, closer. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the far row of cars now. I couldn't tell which vehicle, but the movement of the tarp above suggested something, or someone, was climbing across the tops of the vehicles as they knocked. The girl next to me whimpered. The boy hissed for her to stay quiet. I saw him place a hand over her mouth. Another scream. This time there was no cutoff. It dragged on, high-pitched and piercing before descending into choked gurgles. And then the plastic rippled. A heavy weight slammed onto the roof of the car nearest mine. The frame bent slightly under the pressure. The creature was here again, this time much closer. Its breathing was heavier now, almost a raspy hiss as it shifted its weight forward. The plastic sheet strained against its form, outlining the hunched figure. I could see the curve of its arched spine, the jutting of elongated arms ending in wicked claws. Its head swiveled sharply, snapping back and forth like a predator catching scent trails in the air. Click. An immediate answer echoed back. Click. Click. They were coordinating. The knocking ceased. I knew then that whoever had been knocking was gone. The thing crouched lower, its limbs flexing. I could hear the faint scratch of its claws tracing along the windows, probing for weaknesses. The soft rub of talons against glass made my stomach twist. One wrong move, one slip, one sound, and it would be inside. My phone vibrated suddenly, only once, a weak buzz from some lost background notification. The sound was barely audible, but the creature froze. Its head twisted toward my vehicle. Click. I bit my lip hard, tasting blood, forcing my body into absolute stillness. My lungs burned for air. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything but sit here and wait for it to find me. The weight shifted again as it crept along the roofline, claws tapping lightly along the metal like fingers on a drum. It moved toward the rear window, pressing down, the glass audibly groaning under its weight. The frame creaked with dangerous tension. Then, without warning, something else caught its attention. Farther down the line of cars, a loud bang echoed. A panicked driver had kicked open his door in a desperate attempt to flee. The creak of metal bending outward rang across the clearing, immediately drawing the attention of every creature inside. The one on top of my car stiffened, paused, then leapt away, its heavy form making the tarp above billow violently. The sound of claws scraping metal vanished into the distance, swallowed by the growing chaos. More screams erupted. The desperate man who had broken his car door open never even made it 10 feet. His shriek ended quickly, replaced by the sounds of tearing, thrashing, and the dull thuds of something heavy being thrown against hard surfaces. The creatures weren't hunting anymore. They were feeding. I remained frozen in the back seat, my body trembling violently. I wasn't sure how long I could maintain my silence. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The boy next to me in the other car glanced my way through the fogged windows. His face was pale, soaked with sweat, but his eyes were focused. He mouthed 2 words. "Stay down." I nodded. It was all we could do. The screams had faded. What was left was worse. Now there was only the sound of chewing. Wet, slow, deliberate. Something, or several of them, were feeding not far from where I lay coiled in the cramped back seat, my body trembling uncontrollably. Each sickening rip and crack of bone seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath me, and with every muffled snap of sinew tearing free, my stomach lurched. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, so strong it almost tasted sweet. I fought back the urge to vomit, pressing my forehead against my knees to steady my breathing. Any noise, even the faintest, might be enough to bring them back. Through the narrow gap at the edge of the tarp, I caught fleeting glimpses of what they were doing. Limbs being yanked, twisted unnaturally, a slick trail of something viscous smeared across the side of a nearby car as one of the creatures dragged part of a body under the sagging plastic. They worked with disturbing coordination. Silent signals, careful positioning, like predators that had done this many times before. I couldn't help but think of my brother again. Was this what happened to him? Was this why his accident never made sense? The empty reports, the refusal from authorities to discuss details. Was this what they covered up? I clenched my teeth, biting down so hard I thought I might crack a molar. Movement nearby pulled me back. The boy in the car next to mine, his eyes wide, his breathing sharp but controlled, was inching toward his own door. He was small, wiry. He might be able to squeeze through a gap in the side mirror, where the cars weren't quite as tightly packed. His girlfriend gripped his sleeve, trying to stop him, but he shook his head, mouthing something to her I couldn't make out. He looked toward me for a moment. "Don't." I wanted to scream the word at him, but I couldn't risk even a whisper. He slowly pushed his door open an inch, just enough to slip his fingers out. He began feeling for space, trying to see if there was a pocket large enough to squeeze through. For a moment he stopped, held perfectly still. I saw his face change, his pupils shrinking, his lips parting slightly in horror. He withdrew his hand quickly. I knew why. A single talon, glistening, wet, and curved like a scythe, slid through the narrow opening from the outside. It hovered where his hand had just been, flexing once like a finger testing the air. The creature had been waiting. The boy froze, trapped halfway through his escape attempt. The claw flexed again, tapping lightly against the metal frame. Then came the click, short and sharp. An answer clicked back from somewhere deeper in the lot. The hunt was shifting. The girl inside the car buried her face in her hands, silently sobbing. The boy, to his credit, didn't make a sound. He slowly, painfully, eased the door shut again, retreating back into the vehicle's suffocating safety. But I knew that door wouldn't hold long. They had marked him now. Suddenly, a noise erupted from deeper within the sea of vehicles, a loud, panicked banging, then the shriek of twisting metal as another car door was forced open. Someone else had broken. It was enough to shift the creature's attention. The clicking chorus burst to life around us, urgent and sharp, as several of them dashed toward the disturbance. I couldn't see the victim, but I heard them, screaming, pleading, then choking. A wet thud followed. Then more chewing. Every instinct in me screamed to move, to run while their attention was focused elsewhere. But where could I go? There was no real exit. The cars had been packed too tightly. Even if I got out, I would be exposed beneath the tarp. I felt my chest tighten as my breath grew faster. My vision blurred for a moment, my body trapped somewhere between panic and paralysis. Then, from the far left corner of the lot, a new sound emerged, ripping plastic. The tarp was being torn, methodically, section by section, as something outside sliced into it. For a terrifying moment, I thought perhaps even more of them were entering, but when the flap pulled back, I saw something different. Flashlights. Figures dressed not in riot gear, but in full hazmat suits. They moved with precision, carrying equipment that looked like sprayers or fogging machines. Their faces were completely obscured by heavy respirators and dark visors. I recognized the symbol printed on their shoulders, a red triangular insignia with a biohazard symbol inside it. They weren't here to rescue us. They were here to contain whatever remained. A voice rang out over a handheld speaker, flat and clinical. Level 5 breach in progress. Non-compliant civilians have been neutralized. Commence sterilization sweep. Non-essential witnesses will be processed for debrief. The words didn't sound like any language meant for civilians. They spoke as if we were all just variables in some experiment gone wrong. Two of the hazmat operatives pointed toward the area where the creatures fed, and clouds of white fog burst from their nozzles. The hiss of chemicals filled the air, and the creatures hissed back, angry, screeching now, before vanishing deeper into the maze of cars. The hunters were retreating, but not defeated. The agents methodically moved forward, section by section, spraying the mist. Every movement they made was rehearsed, almost robotic. I didn't know if the fog was meant to incapacitate the creatures or simply drive them back for collection. The boy in the car next to me stared at the agents with the same horror he had reserved for the creatures. His girlfriend clutched his arm, as lost as I was. We were never meant to survive this. I huddled lower, trying to stay beneath the seats, as one of the agents stepped directly onto the hood of my car, his boot planting heavily with a metallic thud. I could hear the hiss of the sprayer passing just inches from my windshield, and then his voice crackled through his headset. "Second wave inbound. Prepare the netting." The tarp wasn't to protect us, it was the net. The air beneath the tarp grew thicker as the sterilization mist spread through the vehicles. My eyes burned, my throat itched. Every breath carried the acrid bite of chemicals, mixing with the coppery smell of blood that still hung heavy in the heat. The creatures were retreating but not defeated. They moved in the shadows, always present, clicking from the far corners of the lot as the hazmat team advanced like a slow, deliberate flood. For a moment, I had thought the agents were here to save us, but that illusion had shattered quickly. They weren't here for us. We were simply collateral variables inside their experiment. The agent standing on my car shifted his weight as another voice crackled through his earpiece. Containment breach stabilized. Secondary extraction team en route. He leapt off my hood with unsettling agility, moving to the next row of cars, where two agents were already laying down wide black strips. Flexible netting lined with metallic fibers. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't evacuation. The boy and girl in the car next to me stared at the agents with wide, panicked eyes. The girl's face was streaked with silent tears, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth to stifle any sob that might escape. The boy's knuckles were white against the door handle, his breath shallow, ragged. Suddenly the clicking began again, faster, sharper, this time from above. My stomach dropped as the tarp overhead shifted violently. The creatures weren't fleeing, they were repositioning. The agents heard it too. "Movement overhead," one of them called out. "Multiple signals. Level 5 packs regrouping." The term packs chilled me to the bone. The creatures weren't acting as wild animals. They were coordinated. They understood this process better than we did. They'd been through it before. A sharp tearing sound ripped through the tarp near the opposite end of the lot. The thick plastic shredded downward as something heavy slashed through with precision. Pale moonlight flooded through the opening for just a brief second, illuminating several of the creatures as they descended from the upper layer of the tarp into the sea of cars below. They were larger than I had realized, towering over 7 feet tall when fully upright, with shoulders hunched forward and legs bent like monstrous predatory birds. Their skin glistened under the light, smooth and black, like tar freshly spilled. Their jaws split wide open, unhinging unnaturally, revealing layers upon layers of needle-like teeth. The agents opened fire instantly. Bright flashes of muzzle flare lit up the interior of the dome as automatic bursts of gunfire tore into the creatures, but the rounds seemed to do little. The creatures recoiled slightly but pushed forward with terrifying speed. Screams erupted, agents being pulled down from atop vehicles, weapons clattering to the ground as claws tore through suits like paper. The netting meant to trap them was instead shredded and tossed aside as they advanced. One of the creatures leapt across 2 rows of cars, landing on the roof of the sedan directly behind mine. The metal collapsed inward, the windshield spiderwebbing from the impact. The couple inside shrieked in terror, but their voices were cut short as long, black claws punched through the roof. Blood sprayed against the inside of their windows. The girl beside me couldn't contain herself any longer. She let out a sharp sob that echoed too loudly through the confined space. Her boyfriend clamped a hand over her mouth, shaking his head desperately, but the damage was done. The nearest creature snapped its head toward our row. Click. An answering chorus of clicks followed. They were communicating again, zeroing in. I couldn't breathe. Every nerve screamed to run, to fight, to do anything but sit here and wait. But there was nowhere to go. We were caged like livestock. A metallic grinding sound to my right startled me. A car door being pried open from the outside. One of the agents, still alive, was trying to pull someone free from a nearby vehicle. "Get out now!" The agent barked through his respirator, his voice distorted but commanding. A family of 3, parents and a young boy, scrambled out as the agent pulled them toward one of the remaining netted corridors. But behind him, 2 creatures dropped silently from above. They landed on him in a blur, one driving a claw through the agent's back as the other tore the respirator free. His screams were short, replaced by wet gurgling as blood foamed from his mouth. The family froze, paralyzed in place. The creatures didn't attack the civilians. Instead, they watched, towering, heads cocked, black eyes unblinking. One of them emitted a long, slow click directly at the child, who whimpered and buried his face into his mother's coat. And then, like a signal had been received, the creatures withdrew, vanishing once more into the rows of cars, leaving the family unharmed. I didn't understand. Why spare them? The netting on the far end of the lot began collapsing as more creatures shredded their way through the thin barriers, overwhelming what little resistance remained. Gunfire was sporadic now, more desperate than coordinated. The agents were losing. In the chaos, the boy in the car next to me locked eyes with me again. His lips formed the words, "We have to move." I knew he was right. Staying put any longer meant waiting for our turn to die. He carefully eased his door open, sliding his thin frame through the gap between the 2 cars, moving like a shadow. His girlfriend followed, squeezing out behind him, barely able to fit through the narrow space. They gestured to me, urging me to follow. My entire body screamed in protest as I unfolded myself from the cramped back seat. My legs were numb. My arms shook. But I forced myself forward, inching toward the door, pressing my body sideways as I pushed it open just enough to slip out. The chemical-laced air outside hit me like a slap, burning my eyes and throat, but the open space, however limited, felt like freedom. We stayed low, crawling beneath the vehicles, moving as quietly as we could. Overhead, the plastic tarp rippled violently as more of the creatures scurried along its surface, hunting from above like shadows stalking trapped prey. Every creak of metal, every shift in weight sent jolts of terror through my spine. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The cold, wet dirt scraped against my palms as I crawled beneath the tight line of cars. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I tried to keep quiet, my heartbeat pounding so hard I swore it was loud enough for them to hear. The creatures moved overhead like vultures circling a dying animal, their weight making the metal frames groan with every step. The two students were just ahead of me, leading the way. The boy would glance back every few feet, his face pale but focused, as though silently checking that I hadn't lost my nerve or fallen behind. His girlfriend followed close behind him, her knuckles scraped raw from the sharp undercarriages she was squeezing beneath. Somewhere to our right, a heavy thud vibrated through the ground, a creature landing nearby. We all froze instantly. The girl pressed her hand tightly over her own mouth, her chest heaving as she struggled not to sob. The clicking resumed, slow, deliberate. They were close. I pressed my body flatter against the ground, feeling the gravel bite into my skin. The chemical sting in the air burned my eyes and throat, but I didn't dare cough. The creature's shadow passed slowly along the side of the vehicle just above me, its three taloned toes flexing as it paced. Click. An answer clicked faintly from deeper inside the maze of cars. They were talking to each other, coordinating. I could almost feel its gaze sweeping across the rows, hunting for movement, but we stayed frozen, becoming one with the shadows beneath the rusted metal shells. A scream tore through the air, breaking the stillness. It came from somewhere across the lot, a woman's voice shrill with terror. More screaming, then multiple voices yelling over each other, desperate, panicked. The creatures surged in that direction like a pack of wolves drawn to a fresh kill. The heavy thuds of their steps echoed as they moved across the tops of the cars, metal bending beneath their weight. The vibrations rattled my bones. The screams became choke cries cut short one by one. This was not hunting anymore, this was butchery. I clenched my fists, the dirt and shards of glass slicing into my skin as I ground my teeth. I wanted to shut it out. The sounds, the helplessness, the grotesque orchestra of tearing flesh and splintering bones. But there was no escape from it, not even inside my own mind. We kept crawling. The boy ahead motioned toward a narrow gap where two SUVs had been parked at a slight angle, leaving a small wedge of open space beneath their bumpers. We slipped through it carefully, moving into what felt like a slightly wider corridor between two rows. A faint sliver of light filtered in from a tear in the plastic tarp above, cutting a thin line through the suffocating darkness. It was the first glimpse of the outside I'd seen in what felt like hours. My throat clenched at the sight. That thin shaft of moonlight was the closest thing to hope any of us had left. Then the girl stopped abruptly, holding out her hand to freeze us both. Ahead, only a few feet away, was one of the creatures. Its back was turned, crouched low over the mangled remains of what used to be a person. Strings of shredded flesh dangled from its claws as it pulled apart the remains with meticulous patience. Its head twitched at odd angles while it worked, issuing soft clicks as if communicating to itself. Its breathing slow and controlled. I could see the blood glistening along the length of its slick, black body under the moonlight shaft. If it sensed us, it gave no sign yet. But one wrong move. The girl trembled, struggling to contain the rising sob in her throat. The boy silently reached out, gently pulling her hand into his, squeezing it with trembling fingers as his eyes darted between her and the creature. We waited. We had no choice. The chewing slowed. The creature's claws flexed. It lifted what remained of the severed arm it held and bit into it one last time, splitting the bone with a nauseating crunch that made my stomach twist. Then, click. It snapped its head around. I didn't know if it had heard us or sensed us, but its black eyes locked toward our direction. For one suspended moment, we stared at each other. Three humans paralyzed under the gaze of something so alien it barely registered as life. The thing uncoiled slowly, rising to its full height, towering above us beneath the sagging tarp. Its mouth opened wide, displaying rows of jagged teeth gleaming under the faint light. Click. A chorus of clicks answered in the distance, closer this time. The boy whispered, barely audible, "Run." But we couldn't run. Not yet. Instead, we backed away slowly, our limbs moving as quietly as possible beneath the cars. The creature took a step forward, its claws tapping against the metal frames. Another click pulsed through the air like sonar. I glanced behind me, my breath catching. More shadows were gathering in the distance, shapes slithering between the vehicles, responding to the call. The hunt was reigniting. Another screech ripped through the air as one of the creatures leapt from a nearby car, landing heavily atop a van a few rows over. The noise sent a wave of panic through the survivors still hiding elsewhere. I could hear new voices screaming, people breaking ranks, their footsteps betraying their locations. The creatures pounced with terrifying speed. We used the chaos to slip away, crawling deeper into the maze of vehicles, our hands raw and bleeding from dragging ourselves across broken glass and twisted metal. Ahead, the boy found a new opening. An overturned sedan crushed against a small pickup. The collapse had created a cavity barely large enough to fit us beneath. We squeezed into it quickly, pressing ourselves against the cool metal as the slaughter continued around us. The girl whimpered softly, unable to stop the tears now. Her boyfriend wrapped his arm around her protectively, whispering into her ear. His voice cracked, but he forced out the words anyway. "We'll make it. Just a little longer." I didn't share his optimism. Around us, the sounds of death carried on, a chorus of horror that seemed endless. The creatures weren't just feeding anymore. They were toying with the few survivors still foolish enough to move. The rules had changed. This wasn't about containment anymore. This was extermination. The air inside our small pocket of shelter grew hotter by the minute, thick with sweat, blood, and chemical residue. My lungs burned as I struggled to take in small, measured breaths, each one feeling heavier than the last. The girl beside me wept silently into her boyfriend's shoulder, her thin frame shaking with each shallow breath. Beyond the thin shell of metal that protected us, the massacre raged on. The sounds were different now. Less screaming, less fighting. What remained were short, guttural gasps. The people who had once filled this lot, hundreds of them, were being thinned out one by one. Each new crunch, each shrill snap of bone breaking under pressure, hammered against my skull like a drumbeat of inevitability. We were losing. The ground beneath me quivered as one of the creatures passed nearby, its heavy footfalls pressing down with weight that made the metal of the crushed vehicles groan. The clicking had grown constant, like a network of predators updating one another on the progress of the cull. I could no longer tell how many there were. 10? 20? More? They moved with such seamless coordination it was like watching the organs of a single monstrous body at work. The boy shifted beside me, his lips close to my ear. "We can't stay here," he whispered. I nodded. He was right. This space wouldn't hide us for long. Eventually they would clear each section of the lot, checking under every car, rooting out anyone who remained. Our only advantage was that they were still distracted by the others. The final pockets of survivors were making noise, some by choice, others simply unable to control their panic. The chaos was masking our movements, for now. "We move toward the far end," he continued, his voice low, measured. "If we stay low and keep to the edges." The girl clutched his sleeve tightly, shaking her head violently. "We have to," he insisted, gently squeezing her hand. "It's the only way." His determination gave me strength I hadn't thought I still possessed. I forced my cramped legs to respond, slowly crawling backward from the cavity we'd been wedged into, inching toward the narrow gap between two SUVs. Every movement felt agonizing, my muscles stiff from the hours of frozen terror. When we slipped out, the full horror of the lot came back into view. Bodies, or what was left of them, were scattered across the ground between vehicles. Torn limbs, shredded torsos, splashes of dark blood pooling into the dirt and broken glass. Some corpses were still twitching faintly, reflexive spasms in the final moments of life. The girl stifled a sob. I bit down on my own revulsion, trying to stay focused. The largest creature stalked the center of the lot, where the highest concentration of bodies lay. Several of them were feeding, their massive forms hunched like grotesque sculptures under the torn gaps of tarp that now fluttered in the night breeze. Farther ahead, I spotted movement. Not creatures, people. A small group of survivors, no more than 5 or 6, were attempting to flee. They darted between the cars like frightened animals, running for the edge of the lot where the netting had collapsed earlier. One of them made it halfway before the creatures reacted. Two of the beasts launched themselves from atop nearby vehicles, landing directly in their path with horrifying precision. Claws ripped through flesh in seconds. The group scattered, but it didn't matter. The pack was already upon them. We kept crawling, staying low beneath the vehicles, praying the distraction would last. But as we moved, something changed. The clicking slowed. The creatures weren't chasing the fleeing survivors anymore. They had stopped abruptly, many of them turning their heads toward the northern edge of the lot, towards something else. The boy noticed it too. What are they doing? I dared a glance. Beyond the distant rows of cars, several new vehicles had appeared. Large black trucks with no markings, their engines humming low. Men in full tactical gear stepped out, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. Large metal cylinders, thick cables coiled over their shoulders, and strange devices shaped like wide satellite dishes. They moved in unison, setting up equipment along the perimeter. The creatures didn't attack them. In fact, they backed away as the men approached, retreating into the deeper shadows between vehicles, as if repelled by something unseen. The boy stared, his voice cracking. "They're not here to rescue us." He was right. The tactical teams weren't evacuating anyone. They were setting something up, preparing for the next phase of containment. From one of the trucks, a deep, vibrating hum began to rise, like a frequency you could feel vibrating in your chest rather than hear. My teeth rattled. My vision blurred for a moment as the pulsing grew stronger. The creatures hissed in unison, shrinking back farther. Then came the light. Floodlights activated all at once, blasting the lot in harsh, blinding white beams. The darkness was obliterated instantly. I squinted, my eyes burning as the world was exposed under the searing brightness. Now I could see them fully. Dozens of them. Towering, glistening, jaws wide as their needle-like teeth reflected the lights in glimmering arcs. Their bodies flexed unnaturally under the intense beams, their black skin pulsing as if reacting to the frequency. The team leader barked an order through a loudspeaker. "Activate net containment. No civilian extraction. Full sterilization protocol authorized." No civilian extraction. We were never getting out. The netting that had once collapsed was now being hoisted back up by mounted cranes, reforming a flexible perimeter around the entire. The creatures were being herded, not killed. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a harvest. The boy beside me gripped my arm tightly, his voice hollow. "They've done this before." Yes, they had. The frequency kept pulsing, deeper now, like invisible waves vibrating through my chest. Each pulse made the creatures recoil slightly, as if the very air around them was charged. But it didn't drive them away. It controlled them. We kept them within the newly reassembled perimeter. The tactical team moved like clockwork, efficient, silent, cold. They finished raising the net, its metallic fibers catching the light as it rippled across the lot's edge like a massive web. Whatever came next would not involve mercy. The boy beside me tightened his grip on my sleeve. "If we don't move now, we're done." The girl nodded hesitantly, her eyes wide but focused now, like survival was the only thing left anchoring her sanity. I barely recognized myself anymore either. Filthy, drenched in sweat and blood, my mind teetering at the edge of collapse. But I nodded. We began crawling again, staying low, using the floodlight's sharp angles to mask our movement in the thin shadows beneath the remaining vehicles. The creatures stayed clustered in the center for now, responding more to the pulsing frequencies than to us. But it was only a matter of time. We passed bodies, so many bodies, some dismembered, others intact but wrong. Some of the corpses lay in almost peaceful positions, their eyes open and blank, mouths slightly parted as if caught mid-breath. No wounds, no blood, drained. The girl let out a sharp breath, choking back bile. "They don't just eat them," she whispered. The boy didn't respond, neither did I, because we both knew she was right. This was more than feeding. This was collection. Ahead, one of the tactical agents moved close to our row, his boots thudding softly against the ground as he repositioned a transmitter unit. We froze, pressed flat against the dirt beneath a half-crushed SUV. I held my breath as he passed directly above, the dim light glinting off the tubing of his biohazard suit. He never saw us, but I saw something. Clipped to his belt was a small, square tablet. Its screen briefly faced us as he crouched to adjust the unit. A grid of dots, each blinking with red pulses, hundreds of them. Not dots, life signs. The tablet was tracking all of us, not just the creatures, us. The pulse shifted tone again, a sharp modulation that made the creatures hiss and retreat farther toward the center, their heads twitching violently. The agents seized the moment, unfurling more of the metallic netting, closing the ring even tighter. "They're driving them inward," the boy whispered, "like cattle." The girl shook her head, trembling. "What happens when they're done?" The boy didn't answer, but we all knew. We kept crawling, inching closer to the northwestern edge of the lot, where one section of the tarp had completely torn free. Beyond it, I could see the faint outline of the service road where the trucks had first arrived, the only glimpse of freedom any of us had seen for hours. It was possible, barely, but between us and that sliver of hope stood 3 of the agents. Their backs were turned for now, busy coordinating the netting system. Their voices crackled quietly through headsets, giving orders. The boy gestured to me, his fingers trembling. "We wait for the pulse. When it hits again, they all move. The agents turn away." I nodded. He was right. The pulse cycle had grown predictable, roughly every 20 seconds. The moment it hit, the creatures shifted, the agents advanced, and the whole perimeter refocused. We counted silently together. 3, 2, 1. The pulse surged. The creatures hissed and shrank inward as the frequency hammered through the air. The agents, in response, turned their backs toward us as they moved forward with the net, eyes on the writhing mass of creatures being compressed. We moved. Sliding quickly beneath the last few vehicles, we slipped into the torn gap in the tarp. Cold air rushed against my face, sharp and foreign after so long breathing the stagnant, chemical-soaked air inside the dome. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from fragile, dangerous hope. We were outside the perimeter. We stayed low in the tall grass, watching as the agents continued their work inside the clearing, oblivious to the 3 shapes now lying flat just beyond their line of sight. For a brief moment, I thought we'd made it. Then I heard the click. Not from behind us. Ahead. It was subtle, barely audible, but distinct. The familiar wet snap of tongue against palate. One of them had made it outside. I glanced toward the source of the sound. In the shadows beneath a tree line 50 feet away stood a lone figure. Its form was harder to see now without the harsh floodlights, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, hunched, elongated limbs twitching subtly, its head tilting from side to side as if tasting the air. It had been waiting. It knew some of us would try to escape this way. The boy cursed under his breath. The girl whimpered again, her hands clenching fists of grass. It hadn't moved yet. It was watching. Another agent nearby suddenly glanced in our direction. He'd heard something too. His head tilted for a moment, scanning the tree line, then dismissing it, turning back to his task. The creature stayed in place. I didn't understand. It could have rushed us in seconds. Instead, it lingered at the edge, like it was waiting for something else. Some unseen signal or command. Then, from my peripheral vision, I noticed faint movement behind it. Others. 3 more shadows emerged from deeper in the woods, rising silently like ghosts from the tall grass. They weren't part of the herd inside the net. They were something else. I realized, with sinking dread, that this wasn't containment. It was separation. Inside the dome was only one part of whatever this nightmare was. Outside was the rest. We had escaped nothing. The creatures here weren't being driven. They were the ones watching the watchers. The boy's voice was barely a breath now. "We need to go. Now." The trees ahead swayed gently in the night breeze, their skeletal branches backlit by the faint moonlight slicing through the clearing mist. But it wasn't the trees that held my attention. It was the four shadows now fully visible beyond the tree line. They weren't like the others. Their movements were more deliberate, more aware. They didn't shuffle like beasts being driven by instinct. They stood upright, balanced. Their elongated arms hung loosely at their sides, claws flexing slowly as though tasting the space between us. One of them tilted its head toward us. Its face was featureless except for the glistening slit of its wide mouth, which pulsed open and shut in slow, deliberate click. The sound wasn't frantic like the others. This was slower, measured, as if it was testing us, gauging our response. For the first time all night, I felt something worse than terror. Recognition. These weren't the cattle inside the containment zone. These were something older, something that didn't fear the agents or their machines. They were the reason the agents were here in the first place. The boy beside me whispered, "They're not part of it." I barely managed a nod, my eyes locked on the closest figure. It shifted forward a step, smooth, effortless, its toes barely touching the earth as it glided closer. The agents inside the clearing still hadn't noticed. The pulse had distracted them again, their attention locked on tightening the net and driving the remaining herd inward. The lights inside the dome flickered momentarily as the next containment phase surged. The creature ahead of us didn't flinch. The girl whimpered behind me, her fingers digging into my shoulder. "What do we do?" The boy's jaw clenched. "We move sideways. Keep low. Use the ditch." Just to our right, about 20 feet away, was a narrow depression where rainwater had carved a shallow runoff between the lot and the woods. And if we could get into it, we might have enough cover to circle behind the tree line and avoid direct sight lines. But there was one problem. The creature stood between us and the start of that trench. The boy's breathing quickened. "On my count," he whispered. We split up. "Draw it for just a second." "Long enough." The girl's grip tightened. "No. We don't have a choice," he said softly. "If we stay here, we're dead. If we move together, it'll corner us. But if we split..." He didn't finish the sentence. We all knew the risk. He looked at me, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I'll draw it left. You take a right. Get to the trench. Crawl west until you see the service road." I hesitated. He stared back at me, eyes burning. "Please." The pulse behind us surged again. The agents shouted fresh commands as the herd compressed further inside the dome. The floodlights inside flared brightly once more, casting flickering shadows out toward the forest where we lay. One of those shadows twitched. The closest creature was still watching. The boy counted softly. 3, 2, 1, and then he moved. Breaking into a low sprint, he dashed left, weaving between the scattered brush. The creature snapped toward him instantly, its head jerking sharply at the sudden movement. Click. The others behind it shifted too, their attention drawn toward the motion. Without waiting, I grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her to the right, staying as low as possible as we slid into the edge of the ditch. The dirt beneath us was slick with moisture, but it offered enough depth to shield us partially from view. We crawled fast, ignoring the burning in our knees and elbows as branches whipped at our faces. Every fiber of my body screamed to look back, but I didn't. We couldn't afford to. Behind us, I heard the boy's footfalls pounding hard against the earth, then the snapping of branches as something massive gave chase. His breathing grew louder, more desperate. Another series of clicks echoed, louder, angrier, then silence. The girl choked on a sob, but I tugged her forward, forcing us deeper into the trench. We crawled for what felt like miles, though it was likely only a few hundred yards. The roar of the containment engines behind us slowly faded, replaced by the steadier hum of wind pushing through the treetops. Finally, I saw it. The narrow service road cut like a gray ribbon through the forest ahead, barely visible under the thin cloud cover reflecting faint moonlight. We crawled out of the trench, collapsing briefly against the tree roots as we caught our breath. My chest burned, My muscles shook, but we were out, for now. The girl wiped the sweat from her face, her voice a broken whisper. We left him. I swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. We had to. Even as I said it, the words felt hollow. The guilt pressed down heavier than the fear ever had. In the distance, faintly, came the final phase of the containment. A deep, rising mechanical tone vibrated through the earth, far more powerful than before. Then, an unnatural silence fell over the entire lot behind us. No clicks, no screams, nothing. I didn't want to imagine what that final phase meant. The girl clutched my arm. Where do we go? I scanned the empty road ahead. There were no headlights, no sounds of rescue, only the open stretch of dark asphalt disappearing into the trees. West, I whispered. We stay off the road. We find a town, somewhere far. She nodded weakly, and together we stumbled forward into the shadows. But deep down, even as we moved, I knew we hadn't escaped anything. Whatever controlled that lot, whatever oversaw the containment, they knew we were out here, and they were still watching. The road disappeared behind us, swallowed by the trees in the black void of night. Only the steady crunch of our footsteps in the underbrush filled the silence now. The girl's breathing was ragged beside me, a constant reminder that neither of us had anything left to give, but we kept moving. We'd walked for what felt like hours, navigating the thin game trails threading through the woods. The hum of the containment site was long gone now, leaving only the soft rush of wind whispering through skeletal branches above. But something still lingered, an invisible weight, like eyes pressing into my back. The girl clutched my arm tighter every time a branch cracked or the wind shifted unexpectedly. Even in the open forest, neither of us could shake the sense that we weren't alone. We need to find help, she whispered hoarsely. There's nothing out here. Her voice trembled. There has to be. I didn't answer. Truth was, I wasn't sure there was help anymore. Whatever we'd stumbled into, it was bigger than anything ordinary people could stop. There weren't going to be search parties or rescue helicopters, no news vans. The entire thing would vanish, sanitized like it never happened, like my brother's death had been. But I didn't say any of that. I just kept walking. The trees finally broke around us into a narrow clearing. In the distance, lights glowed faintly. A small cluster of buildings, half buried in the hillside. A town, or what was left of one. We moved faster now, half stumbling, half running, ignoring the screaming protests of our bodies as adrenaline carried us the final stretch. The town was old. Rusted metal signs swayed in the wind, their paint long faded. A weather-beaten church stood at its center, its steeple crooked, bell tower silent. Windows boarded, no movement, no sound. Black Hollow. The name carved into a broken wooden placard near the edge of the street confirmed it. I knew this place, vaguely. My brother had once mentioned it. Small, mostly abandoned after the mine shut down, the kind of place nobody paid attention to anymore. Perfect for people who didn't want to be found, or for things that didn't want witnesses. The girl stumbled beside me. It's dead! Good. My voice was harsher than I intended. That means they aren't here. We pressed forward, searching for shelter. Most of the buildings were collapsing, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. Only the church looked intact enough to offer cover. The doors groaned as we pushed them open, hinges protesting loudly in the still night. Inside, stale air greeted us. Dust thick in every beam of moonlight slicing through the broken stained glass windows. Pews sat in disarray, several overturned, others split and rotting. We made our way toward the back, finding a small storage room behind the pulpit. The girl collapsed against the wall the moment we stepped inside, her hands shaking as she hugged her knees to her chest. I locked the door behind us, though I knew it wouldn't stop anything if they found us. Still, it was something. For a few moments, we simply sat there in the silence. My heart thudded in my ears. the phantom echoes of the containment site replaying again and again in my mind. The clicking, the screams, the hum of the machines, the blank eyes of the agents. The girl's voice broke the quiet. "Do you think they'll follow us here?" I hesitated before answering. "They already have." Her eyes widened. "You saw them too," I nodded. "The ones outside the net, the ones not part of the herd." She swallowed hard. "They are different. They're smarter." A long pause hung between us. She stared down at the dusty floorboards. Why us? Why any of it? I didn't know, but I'd seen enough to start forming the shape of something much worse. They weren't just containing them, I said quietly. They were maintaining them. She looked up, confused. It wasn't an accident. That entire operation was rehearsed. They weren't trying to wipe them out. They were managing them, hurting them. For what? She whispered. For whatever those outside the net are. The words tasted bitter even as I said them aloud. It was a structure, layers within layers. The creatures inside the dome were terrifying, but they weren't in control. They were livestock. The real threat never stepped into the containment zone. They didn't have to. Her voice cracked. We're part of it now. I couldn't argue. Somewhere outside, the wind shifted again. A branch creaked against the old church siding. My pulse quickened. Every sound felt like a trigger ready to detonate the fragile illusion of safety we'd built in this hollowed-out ruin. Then the bell above us groaned softly, just once, as the wind nudged it. We both froze. That sound hadn't come from the wind. A shadow passed briefly outside one of the high windows. Smooth, quick, gone as fast as it appeared. The girl gasped, her whisper barely audible. "They're here!" I rose slowly, peering through the thin crack between two warped boards. The streets outside were still empty, but the silence had changed. Not empty, waiting. My skin prickled as cold realization settled over me. They weren't hunting. They were observing. I pulled back from the window and lowered my voice. "We move at first light." She shook her head desperately. "What if? We have to. If we stay, we die. If we run, we might still die, but at least it won't be like the others." Her eyes welled, but she nodded. We sat in silence again, pressed into the corner of that broken storage room, too exhausted to sleep, too terrified to speak. Outside, something clicked softly in the distance. Closer than before. They weren't rushing us. They were watching, waiting, learning. The first pale glow of dawn crept through the gaps in the warped wooden walls, spilling faint stripes of weak sunlight across the rotted floorboards. The girl beside me hadn't slept, her eyes wide, bloodshot, fixed somewhere far away. I hadn't either. Every time my lids grew heavy, a click somewhere outside jolted me awake again. The night had stretched into something unnatural, like time itself was bending beneath the weight of fear. But now, at last, morning had come. And they were still out there. The clicks continued even now, but softer, less frequent, as if the creatures outside no longer needed the cover of darkness to track us, or perhaps they simply enjoyed the slow suffocation of our hope. I rose slowly, testing my legs. They trembled beneath me like hollow sticks. My throat was dry, my muscles sore, but the adrenaline hadn't faded. "It's time," I whispered. The girl nodded. Her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles had turned pale. Neither of us spoke the words we both felt. This might not work. We eased the door open, every creak sounding deafening in the fragile quiet. Outside, the town remained still. The ruins of Black Hollow stood like decaying monuments, their hollow windows staring back at us like empty eyes. We crept down what remained of the main street, moving between abandoned cars overtaken by creeping vines and rust. The silence here felt wrong. Not peaceful, but staged. A silence designed to lure prey into believing it was safe. The road sloped downward ahead, where an old gas station sat at the edge of town. Beyond it, dense forest resumed. If we could reach the tree line again, Maybe, just maybe, we could disappear. Halfway down the slope, I froze. Ahead of us, standing in the center of the cracked asphalt, was one of them. Not one of the herded creatures from the containment lot. One of them. Its long, slick body glistened in the faint morning light, the skin almost translucent in places where thin blue veins pulsed underneath. The elongated head tilted slightly as it regarded us, its wide, lipless mouth flexing open with a familiar, sickening click. The girl gasped behind me. I instinctively stepped in front of her. The creature didn't move. It was waiting again. And then, another figure emerged from behind the rusted shell of an overturned pickup nearby. But it wasn't one of the creatures. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in plain dark clothing, and wore no protective suit. No mask, just a simple black jacket and slacks, as if he were attending a funeral that never ended. His face was pale, strangely smooth, almost mannequin-like, but his eyes were alive. Calm, sharp, studying us. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture neither threatening nor comforting. "Don't run," he said. His voice was soft, almost kind. "If you run, it will trigger them." My throat constricted. "Who are you?" "A custodian," he replied. "That's what they call us now." The creature beside him let out a low, wet clicking noise, but made no move toward us. The girl clung to my arm. "Why are you letting us go?" The man smiled faintly. "Letting you go? No." He shook his head slowly. "You were never meant to see any of this, but now you have, which makes you valuable." He glanced toward the creature as if speaking to it silently. The creature remained still, its wide black eyes fixed entirely on us. "You survived the threshold event," the man continued. "You saw them. That gives us data, patterns, reactions. You're studying them," I said bitterly. "You're working with them." His expression didn't change. "We contain them. We adapt with them. Survival isn't about winning. It's about managing risk." The girl's voice broke. "You let people die." The man exhaled, as if mildly inconvenienced. "Some loss is necessary to ensure long-term stability. The alternative would be far worse." Behind him, two more figures stepped from the tree line. Both men, both wearing the same dark clothing. They flanked the creature without fear, moving like handlers beside a tranquilized beast. "You have two choices," the custodian said softly. "You can be processed like the others. Anesthetized, debriefed, reintegrated. You won't remember anything." He took one slow step forward. "Or you stay aware. You remain part of the ongoing observation unit. It's unpleasant, but you'd serve a purpose." I felt the girl tremble behind me. Her breathing quickened. Her fingers dug into my arm. My mind raced. This was never about survival. It was about control. The choice they offered was just another layer of containment. I stared back at him. "And if we refuse?" His smile returned, thin, polite, inevitable. "You won't." I glanced at the girl. She shook her head furiously, tears pooling in her eyes. She wanted to run. I wanted to run too. Every primal instinct screamed at me to bolt for the woods, to take my chances in the trees. But I knew better. The moment we did, the creatures would react, and there would be no more offers after that. This is what they'd always intended. I took one shaky breath. "We'll comply." The custodian's smile widened slightly. "Wise." One of the other men approached and handed him a small black case. He opened it, revealing two small devices, thin metallic discs with blinking green lights. "Step forward," he said gently. "This will only take a moment." The girl's sob turned into a quiet, desperate whimper. I squeezed her hand one last time, and together we stepped forward. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey through the ceiling. In a world where the unknown lurks just beneath the surface, sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones in the dark, but the ones managing them. If you enjoyed this story and want more unsettling tales of horror, mystery, and survival, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep bringing these chilling stories to life. Until next time, Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, not every door should be opened.